Hello and welcome to the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma. Joining me is Professor Harsh Pant. Uh, this week, the world looked at 2 decades of 9/11 and what has it changed for the world. 2 decades after 9/11 was a stark reminder of the threat of terrorism, which is still looming large, with the Taliban gaining power yet again in Afghanistan. And with the same brutality, there was no change in the attitude of the Taliban. All that we will look at what's happening in Afghanistan, the pictures that are coming out of women protesting, women in hijab, women saying this is not what they wanted, no participation of the women and the other factions in the new Taliban government, and how some of the most wanted on the FBI list are in this new government. All that. Another interesting thing that happened this week was the BRICS summit, which was chaired by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and how the BRICS countries were unanimous in their approach towards dealing with terrorism. And India, Australia has started an inaugural 2+2 dialogue. All of that we will be looking at on this episode of the Ideas Factory. Very warm welcome to you, Harsh.
Thanks, Anga.
So, Harsh, 2 decades down the line from the war on terror, and the war on terror is hardly over or far from over. The pictures that are coming from Afghanistan are, the same atrocities, the same brutality. Women in hijab, women protesting, but at the same time, very interesting pictures coming out with of women in hijab saying that they are pro-Taliban. So that is also now being staged. So that narrative is being built. But let's look at the new government, or the temporary government, as they say, which has now come to power and which has some of the dreaded terrorists, some of whom are on the FBI list. How will this government function? Will there be legitimacy or acceptancy? And do the Taliban really care for legitimacy?
Yes, I might say, it's just to start with the 9/11 framework. It's quite ironical that we are commemorating rather the 20th anniversary of 9/11 with the with the strange feeling, because it seems to be back to the future. It seems that we are back where we started from, in the at least in the AFPAC region. The idea that post 9/11 American forces, America's military and political might, would be able to deliver a knockout punch to the to the Taliban, to some of the dreaded terrorist groups in the region, has come to naught. The fact that Taliban are back in power exactly the same day they were unfurling their own flag in Afghanistan, the day the world was commemorating 9/11, I think it's a stark reminder of how the more things change, the more they remain the same. The idea that American military presence would usher in a transformation in Afghanistan was something that I think started on the right foot, started on the right note. There was obviously, after 9/11 attacks, America led the campaign to remove Taliban from power, and to bring a modicum of political institutionalization in Afghanistan towards democracy. Uh, I think where perhaps American foreign policy veered away, or American national security strategy veered away, was that instead of focusing on doing its best for Afghanistan, very soon, the diversion took place and the Iraq war happened. And I think that spawned its own set of consequences for Middle East, for American foreign policy, for America. And I think Afghanistan became a part of that narrative. That Afghanistan war initially, if you remember, this was the good war. This was the war that America was supposed to be fighting. This was what Obama said. And we don't want to do anything. The comparison was drawn with Iraq, which was not the right kind of war, perhaps, as the argument was made. And so, over a period of time, we have seen American public getting restless, the fatigue setting in. And the result is that there is no domestic constituency today that wants America to be doing these kind of nation building enterprises. And that's the reason why President Biden said we were never in Afghanistan for nation building. So I think the fatigue of the last 2 decades, from Afghanistan to Iraq, leading to domestic dysfunctionalities in America. America is today more polarized than ever before. The fact that these 2 decades allowed China to emerge as the most important power challenging America on a number of fronts. I think all those questions are now front and center. And 9/11 and 20 years down the line, I think we are looking back at a world that has been transformed, but transformed, in some ways, not for the right reason, because the question of terrorism, the question of extremism and radicalization is still there. And I don't think any country has any good answers after 2 decades, of fighting and trying to find some way out of this conundrum. And I think the world today is much more fragmented, and the possibility, therefore, that the kind of consensus, the kind of support that America had in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, that won't be possible. And in the absence of that global consensus, any fight towards terrorism is going to be drawn along the lines of geopolitics. So therefore, we are now going to see this idea that some good terrorist, bad terrorist narrative, China supporting some elements of the sections of the Taliban, America trying to make this divergence between ISIS, Khorasan, and Taliban in Afghanistan. I think all that is a reflection that ultimately this has become a big geopolitical power game. And the issue of terrorism, which in an ideal world should have spawned global consensus, is nowhere any we are nowhere near any sort of reconciliation on that question. And I don't really see a way forward as far as the global community is concerned in trying to find answers to the questions that in some ways led to 9/11.
So, that really means that the global community is now looking at a larger threat emanating from terrorism and the entire AFPAC region, because it just come back to a full circle. The Taliban are in power. The whole myth that was propagated by America, distinguishing between the good and the bad Taliban, or kind of reassuring the world that this is Taliban 2.0 and this is going to be different. Now, Afghanistan is reeling under Taliban and its trademark brutality, and the myth perpetuated by the West is falling apart. It's the same Taliban. Look at the atrocities. Look at how the journalists were beaten. So, the war on terror is far from over. The threat, in fact, is larger when you look at that, with the Taliban now in power and some of the most wanted terrorists being in government. How do we look at this and the war on terror and what is coming out of Afghanistan and the new government that has taken shape there?
Oh, what has happened is that, on the one hand, America's war in Iraq spawned the whole ISIS phenomena, which is in some ways gets reflected in what is happening in Afghanistan with ISIS Khorasan. But I think in Afghanistan, we are now in this strange position of trying to figure out if, compared to ISIS, the Taliban are the moderates. And this argument that, look, at the end of the day, which some American officials have made, America is going to work with Taliban in towards counterterrorism. We're targeting ISIS. I think all of this, is about post facto rationalization of something that everyone knew is coming. That there was a great degree of certainty that Taliban will gain ascendancy, Taliban will become the most powerful element in Afghanistan. But how to proceed towards political reconciliation? Perhaps there has been some mistakes, in the process. There have been some mistakes in the way the larger world community has reacted to it. And the sense, that Taliban are changing, or that Taliban are going to become a different entity, has also sprung from this belief that because Taliban, certain kinds of, certain factions of the Taliban were negotiating in different parts of the world, that ultimately would lead to a situation where a lot of uh, the world thought that ultimately this is about engaging with the new Taliban, and it turns out that once you are in power, Taliban is back to square one. That all those, whether it is minorities, whether it is the challenges in the region, and whether it is the way other stakeholders are being dealt with. I think all of those questions are back to square one. There has not been an inclusive government. There has not been any representation to those who perhaps will lay the foundation for a sustainable peace in Afghanistan. So I'm not so sure whether this whole debate, this about changing Taliban, is going to give us any real results. But I think what it has certainly done is that it has certainly given Taliban a certain legitimacy. Even if at this point that legitimacy may not be formal, but I think de facto the fact that they have a government, the fact that they are now appointing people in different positions, the fact uh, that they are engaging with international institutions and different governments, I think all of that is becoming very, very.
All right. So, like you mentioned, Harsh, the more it changes, the more it remains the same. The situation in Afghanistan is very, very fluid right now, and we're looking at the world. Uh, it's not really certain what kind of legitimacy will this Taliban government get. But while with all these developments in the Afghanistan region, very interestingly, the BRICS summit took place, which Prime Minister Narendra Modi chaired, and it was expected that there will be some discussion on the situation in Afghanistan. So it seemed that there was a strong consensus supportive of India's, perspective on the development in Afghanistan, and the New Delhi Declaration mentioned Afghanistan. It has adopted a common counterterrorism action plan. So, what are the key takeaways from BRICS?
Well, Naghma, it was, I think, an interesting meeting because, from India's point of view, of course, there have been challenges in BRICS, given that India-China relations are on a downward trajectory. I think the fact that even under these circumstances, one can have a conversation on global and regional issues with China, I think is important for India diplomatically. But what I think emerged from that meeting was something interesting and I think the subsequent statement by South Korean foreign minister was also very important because I think he argued, and I think the statement makes a claim that Taliban will have to make certain commitments before they can expect legitimacy from the international community, or including the BRICS platform. And I think some of those commitments are tied up with what we have been discussing about it being an inclusive government, it being representing the minorities, not allowing its territory to be used by terrorists targeting other countries. So I think some of the questions that India has been putting on the table for a while with regard to Afghanistan and Taliban uh, emerged from the declaration, from the BRICS declaration. And I think in that context, perhaps it was successful in mobilizing five major powers from around the world towards articulating this position. Now, I think it remains a different matter whether China, in particular, will adhere to that understanding, because they certainly seem very keen on engaging with the Taliban and moving forward. They've announced an aid package also. They are pushing for greater legitimacy for the government as soon as possible. So, but I think the concerns that India had are increasingly being heard around the world. We are looking at different platforms articulating it. We are also looking at different countries articulating it. For example, India in Australia this week also articulated the same question, same issue. So I think that is perhaps India's way of bringing together like-minded countries on the issue of Afghanistan. Also interesting, perhaps just to mention that you had the CIA chief and Russian national security advisor both at the same time in India, perhaps also reflective of this wider position that India's assessments on Afghanistan have been more on the mark than, say, some of the Western analyses or other countries' perspective. And therefore, perhaps there is a need to engage with the wider world, and for the wider world to engage with India more substantively on the question of the future of Afghanistan.
Absolutely. Like you mentioned, the CIA chief and the Russian counterpart were here and they had a discussion with the NSA here. There is a question which one of our audience has sent, Vikas Bishnoi, about India and Russia. Okay, what about Russia's position? India is engaging with Russia regarding Taliban issue, but not with the US. So will this engagement revive Indo-Russia relationship and maybe the way USA has departed from Afghanistan, will this dent India-US relationship, and how will it affect the Indo-Pacific policies?
Well, I don't think the larger trajectory of Indo-US relationship is dependent on any one particular factor. So I think Afghanistan certainly has created its own set of externalities for India, and that would be reflected in the way US and India engage with each other. But I think what the issue of Afghanistan has also done is to once again make it very clear to India and to Russia that they need each other, that the wider geopolitics in Eurasia is such that the traditional approach that India and Russia had towards the region may have to be resurrected in some form. What form that would take is still not clear, but I think we are seeing now Russia slightly more cautious in its engagement with the Taliban. They are not as optimistic as they were a few days back. They are not, paraphrasing, or even they are not repeating what the Chinese are saying on this issue. I think they are more cautious on this than China, and they seem more in sync with India's position, because remember, this visit was also about assessing what is happening in Afghanistan as well as Pakistan's role in Afghanistan. So clearly, I think there is a wider element of Afghanistan, Central Asia, that is problematic from Russia's perspective,
Yes.
and Afghanistan and South Asia, very important from India's perspective, and which brings India and Russia organically together.
India and Russia are organically together, and we the emotional connect that India and Russia have had, probably that always comes into play. But a very quick comment from you on the India Australia 2+2. Uh, Harsh, because it's a very important time with changes in the geopolitics all around. How significant is the inaugural India Australia 2+2 dialogue, which was led by the Defense Minister and the External Affairs Minister, and what about the focus was about cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, but it has to be seen in the context of the aggressive China and the military assertiveness in this region. Also, Australia and India are part of the Quad that works towards inclusive and open Indo-Pacific. So, how significant is this 2+2?
I think it's very significant because it allows the two nations to look at the region and to look at the bilateral relationship more holistically. And let us also not forget that there are only a few countries that India has 2+2: America, Japan, and now Australia. So I think it also shows the growing importance of Australia and India's foreign policy calculus, and of India and Australia's foreign policy calculus. And I think uh, given that Indo-Pacific is almost bookended by these two countries. On the one side, in the Oceania, you have Australia. On the other side, you have India. As Australia looks more and more westwards towards Indian Ocean, and as India looks more towards the Pacific, I think it's very natural that these two countries, with significant convergence in interests and similar values, democracy and faith in certain kinds of faith in freedom, liberty, and inclusivity in the region, or can also jointly articulate a vision for the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific visions are complementary, and India-Australia relations are perhaps at their highest at the moment they have ever been. They We have moved forward. We have moved to a different level from the traditional cricket, Commonwealth, and curry narrative that used to frame India-Australia relationship, towards now, towards another sea that you were talking about, China driving a lot of these questions. And I think that will allow, and that has allowed the two countries to make this relationship more in tune with 21st century realities. And I think that 2+2 is merely a recognition that new institutional mechanisms are needed if the engagement is widening and deepening at this level.
All right. Yes, India-Australia relationship has been elevated to a comprehensive strategic partnership. So that is very significant that the 2+2 took place, and the BRICS summit has taken place, and a lot of like-minded countries, along with India, are coming together with the narrative on Afghanistan, of what exactly should happen there, and how is it going to affect the security in the entire region, because it's going to affect all the countries, especially the neighbors. So we will be tracking the developments in Afghanistan as more videos and pictures are coming out of the brutality of the Taliban and the resistance that continues in the Panjshir Valley. But that's it from us on this episode of the Ideas Factory. Thank you, Harsh, and thank you all for joining.